Welcome to today's Torah study. Today is September 11th, so our Torah study today will be in honor of September 11th on the topic of putting oneself at risk to save others, in honor of the first responders, both at 9/11 and recently in the tragedies that that happened in Texas, South Florida. I'd like to start actually just with a little prayer, if I may, before. This was a prayer that was written right after 9/11 for those who risked their lives, and it applies to, I guess, to all who put themselves at risk, first responders. May He who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, and Aaron, David, and Solomon, bless the first responders, the security and rescue personnel, who were brave in their hearts and heroic in their deeds. For they were swift as leopards to snatch those at the brink of death from the gates of doom, to extricate those facing their end, to bring them back home to their families and return them alive to their loved ones. Therefore, in reward for this, may God be filled with compassion for all these heroes, and bring them health and security, and keep them alive and strong. May the Creator of wind blow spirit into their souls, and may the one who is long-suffering relieve their shortness of breath, and they merit long life and good sustenance. And may a crown of glory be placed upon their heads, soon, shortly, and speedily, and let us say, Amen. One of the difficult topics, one of the difficult decisions that people have, first responders have to make, or anyone has to make in the face of a tragedy, is to put oneself at risk to help those who are already in a life-threatening situation. And it's not always something that's possible to be done, a split-second decision sometimes. But both in retrospect and even in ahead of time, I was, if you watched some of the Harvey footage, and you watched some of the heroes who, got in their boats in a raging river, and they went and risked themselves to help people who were in definite danger. One has to ask oneself, is one allowed to? I mean, it's really, and for sure commendable, but is it something that you would advise against and say something that you're not, and maybe you're not even allowed to put your own life at risk to save someone else? And we'll try to see why and try to discuss some of the concepts behind it. And I have my opinion, which I'd like to share with you at the end. But again, I'm open and willing to listen and to everyone else. So let's just do the sources. The first source is obviously the most important. The Talmud in Sanhedrin says, "Man was created alone to teach you that anyone who destroys one life is considered by the Torah as if he had destroyed the entire world. And anyone who preserves one life is considered by the Torah as if he has preserved the entire world." That's to encourage and to promote and to explain how great it is when someone goes ahead and helps someone. It's not only saved one person; it's as if you saved the entire world, and not only saved you saved the family. It's immeasurable the greatness of helping and saving one life. Now, so the Talmud asks the question, from where do we know that one who sees someone drowning, being dragged by a wild animal, or being threatened by robbers, is bound to save him? So it's not only a nice thing, but according to Judaism, it's a commandment. One has to do it. So, in other words, if you see someone in danger, you may not stand idly by. It's not only that you're a good person, you're obligated. And where does a verse? It's a verse in Leviticus 19:16. Do not stand aside when your fellow's blood is being shed. Okay, seemingly straightforward. It takes a verse in Leviticus that explains it. But now here, when this is where it gets interesting, the Talmud asks the question: is really that the source? Is it not derived from the following teaching? What is the source that one must restore another's body if it is in danger of being lost? The Torah teaches by saying you shall return it to him, not only his lost object, but his endangered body. That's in Deuteronomy. So the Talmud, in the way it always does, it says it challenges the assumption. The assumption was that the "do not stand idly by" was a good source, and then we have another source. So the Talmud answers, if we had learned the obligation to save the endangered person from the first one, I might have mistakenly thought that my responsibility is limited only to where I could save someone by myself. But there's no necessity to exert oneself and hire others. The Torah therefore writes in other verse in Leviticus, "Do not stand aside," which is a greater level of responsibility. So here so this is the beginning of the discussion that it's very easy to You can say, I can't. Right? Not doing something is pretty easy. We're all aware, and we all have good excuses. So the Talmud tells us that if you would just have the one verse, you would assume, okay, I have to do it, but not if it costs me money, not if I have to work hard, not if I have to put myself in danger, not if I have to do all these things. I have to do it if it's convenient, right? So therefore the Talmud says, no, there's a second verse to tell us that it's not just a question of convenience or it's a nice thing that you're obligated if you can, but you really have to spend money and exert yourself to do it. So the question then is, at what level, right? Did we all have to, right? Let's say you're all, you're not working, but you're in law school. Everyone has jobs. You have to give up your law school, take a week off. They won't let you. You have to help others. You'd say, no, I can't give my whole life for others. So so then you have to rent a boat. We could all rent our boats and go down and do something. Or there are always levels of things you could do. You can give up on everything that you have. And here in the question we're speaking about of putting yourself at risk, you could always put yourself in the craziest risk scenario. Like, where do you draw the line? And it's unclear. But what is clear is that you have to go beyond what you might have been comfortable with. But what the Talmud doesn't give an exact. It can't give an exact distinction for every situation. So there was a. Well, I'm going to skip the next source. So we'll go to the source on the bottom of page 1. We have just a background. The Talmud, when people call the Talmud, there's two Talmuds. There was a Talmud that was edited, redacted, finished in Babylonia. It's called the Babylonian Talmud. It was finished roughly in the year 550 of the Common Era. So about 1,500 years ago, plus minus. That was in Babylonia. There was a whole other group at school of rabbis and who wrote a Talmud, and it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. But Jerusalem was already since 135, Jews were exiled and to the north of Israel. It was finished in the Galilee. That's where the population of Israel was living at the time from the Hadrianic persecutions and onward. And their Talmud is not as authoritative as the Babylonian Talmud because there were many more persecutions and it's not redacted as well. It's in a harder Aramaic. It wasn't considered authoritative, but on the other hand, it is a Talmudic tradition, according to so. That's called the Jerusalem Talmud. I wrote here Yerushalmi because that's just the Yerushalayim is the Hebrew word. So there's a story in the Jerusalem Talmud. Rabbi Ami was kidnapped and held in Sifsafa. I don't know where that place was. Rabbi Yonatan said, Rabbi Yonatan was the prime author of the Jerusalem Talmud, wrote, wrap up the dead in a sheet. In other words, what are we going to do? He was kidnapped, he was captured, there's nothing we could do about it. He's a goner. Rabbi Shimon, son of Lakish, who was a contemporary, said, I will either kill or be killed. I am going, and will release him by force. So he said, you know what? I'm going to take the risk, and I'm going to save him. Where Yonatan had given up. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish went, and he appeased the kidnappers, and they handed over Rabbi Ami. So the Jerusalem Talmud has a tradition, seemingly that one should risk one's life to save someone who otherwise would for sure dead. Because Rabbi Yonatan said, I'm giving up on it, prepare the burial shrouds. And yet Rish Lakish went ahead and said, I am going to put myself at risk. So, I would say from here, that's a pretty good source, a Talmudic source, that one is obligated or for sure should put oneself at risk. The problem is, there's nowhere in the Babylonian Talmud this is mentioned. More than that, it's not mentioned in any of the law books which base itself on the Babylonian Talmud. So it's only found later on in a Kesef Mishnah, is a 16th century, 1500s, middle 1500 work written in Safed, where he quotes the Yerushalmi. They conclude that one is even obligated to enter into possibly dangerous situation in order to save another. It seems that the reason for this is that the victim is in certain danger, whereas the rescuer is only in possible danger. So so fine. He understands that he says that we just understood, but the other part I didn't have a chance to translate it to English. But he points out, he says it's weird that no one else mentioned it from the Jerusalem Talmud in 350 till 1500. It's not mentioned anywhere. No one quotes it. It's not brought down in any law book, and Maimonides doesn't bring it down, and the Code of Law doesn't bring it down. Why is that? Why is it not mentioned at all? So there was a rabbi who came a little bit later, had a very interesting interpretation of a verse in Exodus. So we all know that Moses was brought up in the palace of Pharaoh, and then one day he went out to see his brethren enslaved, and there were these two guys, and then he saw an Egyptian who was beating the Jewish slave, and he killed him. And then the next day, he was afraid for his life, and he ran away. And he ran away to Midian, and he married Jethro's daughter. And then God had a vision to him on the mountain, and God said to him, "Return to Egypt, for all the people that were trying to kill you have died." Well, if God was on Moses' side, why can't Moses just say, "Forget about it. Don't worry about them. I got you. You have my mission. I got your back. I'm God." And that's what I would say if I was God. Like, don't worry, it's me. But he didn't say that. He said, you can return because it's not dangerous anymore. All the people who wanted you to kill you are dead. So this rabbi says, it's because the Torah is teaching you, it is clear from here that if they were still alive, Moses would not have needed to go back, even though he is God's mission. And God said, go to Pharaoh, tell him, let my people go. I'm sorry, God, I can't go, it's too dangerous. Sounds a little funny. But by God telling him, go back because it is safe, what God is telling him is, don't, even for a mission that is vitally important, right, rescuing the Jewish people, nevertheless, if it's too much of a risk, you don't do it. So here we see there's the other side of the tradition, which many claim comes from this Yoma, the third source of page 2. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, if I had been there, I would have said that my source is better than theirs. Right? It says, live by them, but not that you should die through them. All the commandments are there to give you life. If a commandment comes to bring you death, they're not a commandment. There's an overriding principle, live by them, that the commandments give you life. So, many learn from here that if you don't have the right to put by definition, a commandment doesn't put your life at risk, so you cannot go ahead and risk your life. So this is how it basically evolved, the two schools of thought. And today, if you would, I guess, Google it or research it, you'd find in most places they'll tell you that there's a Babylonian Talmud version or opinion that you should not put yourself at risk, and a Jerusalem Talmud based on the story that one is obligated and can put your life at risk. I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm going to go back to page 2, but on page 3 there's a very interesting story came up. This story happened in, I don't know where. It's quoted by a rabbi named Rabbi. Rabbi was born in born in Spain, pardon me, and has made his way. He was born right before the expulsion of Spain, and he eventually made his way to Safed in the 1500s, 16th century. If the government would say to a Jew, allow us to chop off one limb that will not cause you to die, or we will kill your fellow Jew. So there were many, throughout history, there were many despotic rulers throughout in all areas of the world, and the Jews lived in many times under persecution of evil rulers. So this seemingly was a real situation where they said, listen, we have one guy who we want to kill, but if you let us chop your arm off, we won't kill him. Do you have to agree? We're giving you the choice. Do you have to agree to such a thing? In other words, are you obligated to literally sacrifice a limb to save someone else's life? What would you say?
Yeah, according to what you were saying earlier.
So it basically depends on, well, 1 second. I was talking about an assumption of risk. Here, it's not a question of risk. It's you actually have to give, you're going to lose the limb. What do you say, Brett?
Yes. Short answer.
You think yes?
Short answer.
So, he says, I bolded it out on the bottom here. It is a pious act that praises the lot one who could withstand this. However, a possible risk to his life that if allowing his limb to be chopped off would present a possible risk to his life, that such a person would be considered a pious fool. And a pious fool meaning someone who out of piety did a foolish thing. For the doubt regarding his life is greater than the certainty of saving his friend's life. So here you have, he doesn't mention our two cases, but it clearly says that the doubt on your own life is greater than saving someone else's life. You're not obligated to put yourself at risk. So he seems to, vote with the Babylonian Talmud version of the equation. On the other hand, he does say it is a pious act to, if you know for a fact that losing a limb won't kill you, that it's a pious act. He can't say he's not mandating it, but he is saying is that it is something that one should go ahead and do, which seems to be based on the sources that we saw makes sense. But again, it's hard to mandate such a thing. But he definitely comes out on the side that putting oneself at risk is not something that's obligated. So I want to. There's a point here that that needs to be mentioned, and that is, okay, how do you decide? So this is just a side point, which will bring us to the main point. Back on page 2, this is required. There's a commandment to return lost objects, and if one finds your own lost item and your father's lost item, so in other words, you have two, right? You're walking. I don't know example, but let's say two people lose their phones, right? Or something, and you can only save one. You can only return one. Now, finding your own stuff, that's great, but returning your father's stuff, that's even nicer. You would think. If one finds his lost item and his father's lost item, tending to his own lost item takes precedence. You can give precedence to your own stuff. Similarly, if one finds his lost item and his teacher's lost item, tending to his own lost item takes precedence. So you see that the Mishnah, the Talmud here, sets aside. It says you're allowed to be selfish. Yeah, it's a lovely commandment. Honor your father and your mother and your teachers, and that's all great and fine and wonderful. But you're allowed to put yourself in front if you lost stuff. So the Talmud wants to know, where do we know this from? So the quotes a verse in Deuteronomy, only so that there should be no needy among you. This verse can be understood as a command, indicating that it is incumbent upon each individual to ensure that he will not become needy. Therefore, your property takes precedence over the property of another person. That sounds very selfish. It has a ring of selfishness, but it makes sense. There is a verse that you don't have to go ahead and give away all your money for people. So the Talmud ends up with something instructive. That yes, there are technical laws. There are if you want to know precedent, if you want to know what you have to do, but not always should you stick to the principles. And Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav says, although that is the halacha, that is the law, anyone who fastidiously fulfills this principle with regard to his property at the expense of others ultimately comes to experience that fate. He will become impoverished, and others will prioritize their interests at his expense. In other words, there is a divine judge. There is a someone keeping score, and yes, you are allowed to always put your interest first when you're allowed, but then other people will do the same. And what kind of world is that? And it's not a good idea. So here you have the Talmud balancing these things. Okay, here's just property, returning lost objects. And on one hand, you have a right to put yourself first. On the other hand, not a good idea. So a 20th century rabbi living in Russia, that's at the top of page 3, back to our question, the halachic authorities quoted the Yerushalmi, that Jerusalem Talmud, as saying that one is obligated to enter a possibly dangerous situation in order to save another. The early authorities left this out of the codes because it's clear from our Talmud, meaning the Babylonian Talmud, that one is not obligated to endanger himself to save another. Like I said, there's a different traditions, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. However, every situation must be dealt with in context, and one must weigh this matter extremely carefully and not be overprotective of oneself. And anyone who saves one Jew is as if he saved the entire world, based on that first thing. So here we have that he says the answer is there's competing traditions, and you shouldn't be so careful to follow the opinion that you don't have to put yourself at risk. He can't mandate that you have to do it because there is a tradition that you don't have to. So this is, in a way, I know it's been 20 minutes and a little bit of it, but it's a way of introduction. The Talmud, in most cases, and this is where we have to. There's really not many sources. How do we? That's at an individual basis. you see someone, you're walking, someone, you see someone being mugged or attacked. So you see something, you have an obligation. Should you put yourself at risk? Okay. Or your neighbor calls your help, or you're in a situation. How do we approach this at a communal level? First responders, right? Or doctors, or people who have the ability, who are trained. It is risky, but this is what, in a way, they're been trained for. This is what they decided to do. Is that a different set of rules? So there's actually very little literature on, I guess, first responders. But one of throughout history, there have been epidemics. There have been infections that have been dangerous. The one that we're going to talk about is cholera, which in the 1800s or all throughout history, but 1800 was an unbelievable epidemic. You could talk about Ebola recently, or you could talk about, when I was in college, AIDS, which thank God is no longer we have retrovirals, still HIV, but I worked in an AIDS clinic in my freshman, sophomore year of college, and there were doctors who were reticent, and because no one knew, and that back then was a death sentence, and like Ebola could be, and cholera was. But what do you do? If all doctors ran away, if all doctors refused to treat any of these situations, we'd be in a horrible situation. But on the other hand, could every doctor say, well, I don't have to put myself in danger to save others who are for sure in danger? So it is the instances that we find of a communal question. So there's a rabbi who lived in Israel recently, and they asked him this question regarding the doctor's duty. Is it obligatory for a physician to treat a patient with a dangerous contagious disease, especially during an epidemic, or advise him to flee the city? In other words, if one doctor, an individual came to you and said, should I put myself at risk, or should I just run away? What would you tell him? Would you tell him there's two traditions? Right? You say, based on what we said today, you could make a legitimate case for that. So he said the simple answer is that it's forbidden for a doctor who is able to help the sick to run away. It is forbidden to run away. Instead, they should do their utmost to prevent themselves from getting sick, and I've seen this in the works of Rabbi Kiva Eger. So I have it here. I didn't have a chance to translate it, and there was no available translation. It said, just to give you the timing, in 1831 in Prussia, which became part of Germany, which is the border there, Poland, there was an unbelievable uprising and a cholera epidemic at the same time. And there's a very good book which is called Contagion in Prussia, the Cholera Epidemic and the Threat of the Polish Uprising. And the cholera epidemic was affecting everyone in every community, but it also, the authorities were very afraid of unrest, which is, I guess, everywhere. Anytime you have a dictator, you're afraid of unrest. So there was a lot of debate. People were trying to run, they couldn't run away. There was a lot of issues going on. So one of the main rabbis at the time was a rabbi in Posen, Prussia. His name is Rabbi Kiva Eger, and he basically said that it's imperative that we don't tell the physicians and the doctors to run away. We demand that they treat, and we demand that everyone, that is what they are here for. Yes, and cholera is very infectious, and at that time, their medicine, I don't even know what they were doing, but it wasn't so helpful. But it really, but he said you got to do it, and that's what it says here in the Hebrew, that we've got to listen, we've got to make sure. And the third line, I'll read it in Hebrew, I'll translate. Gam sacharnu, we hired, v'hamidu anashim yuchadim, we set aside dedicated people, shehorgulu, who know what to do, that they should always be there no matter what, for the sick, and that's how we're going to take care of it. So Rabbi Wosner, who lived recently in Israel, just recently died in Israel, used this as a precedent that when it comes to community, when it comes to trained responders, doctors, first responders, then they are obligated. They have the right to run away. And that they can't use this debate between the Talmuds to say that, I could choose. And last but not least, there's another responsa recently written in Israel, which discussed it also, and that is, just like we understand, he says a very obvious point, just like we understand that, if every soldier going into battle would say, I'm nervous or I'm dangerous, then and everyone flee. You're obligated. When you become a soldier, you do put your life at risk, and that's accepted. It's an accepted way of the world. And not that we should have wars, but when there is an enemy and there is an evil, then you have to fight it, and you have to put your life at risk, and you're demanded of such a thing, and that is the honorable thing. It says we can extrapolate from there that those who are trained and those who go ahead and say, this is what I want to do, that is what they're supposed to do. So he said, based on all of this, based on the tradition, and this is what I want to say, because if you look, I want to make this point, if you look in the standard literature, you'll always end up with like opinions, Babylonian, Jerusalem, Talmud, you have a choice to put yourself at risk. But when it comes to, I think the point has to be made, when it comes to first responders and trained people, it's not only a good thing, it's not only their choice, but it's really that it's a heroic thing that they have chosen to do, but in a way they're obligated. And that is, in a way, all the more impressive that they've chosen to make themselves obligated. Just like a doctor has no right to run away from epidemic, so too a first responder, those who can help, those who are in life-saving situations, are obligated and therefore have to help others. So it's a wonderful thing when and again, I just wanted to mention we prayed ahead before, but to memorialize all those who rushed in to the buildings of September 11, who didn't think about themselves for 1 second, and they ran into buildings which no one which eventually became their, in many situations that became their grave because there was no body found. It's just the heroism of such people. We should have them in mind today and every day. That there are people who take it upon themselves to help the community and help others, and that I think what is today's National Day of Service. That's what we're supposed to memorialize. And I think the sources bear out that is an unbelievable thing, which they have done. So thank you all for joining me. And any questions?
Rabbi,
Yes.
does it also apply to an off-duty firefighter? If I see the fire in the building?
I don't think duty or off duty has anything to do with it.
So
I think it has to do with training.
So with my training, I can go in?
Yeah, that's what I would say. But again, you don't normally have time to ask the question at the burning, building. But that's my understanding. Questions? No? We're good? Okay, thank you all for joining me.